So as a part of my role today, I'm here to introduce our speaker. I'm going to keep it relatively brief, just so we can catch up on time. But also, if you have the app or on the conference, there's more of an extended bio on Neel Kashkari. So please take some time to read that. Neel is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He's been in this role since January 1st of 2016. Also, as part of his duties, he also serves on the Federal Open Market Committee, where the Fed makes decisions about interest rates and other monetary policy. So as we've seen in the news, interest rate increases. Now, no hard questions about that for Neel today. We're going to keep that simple. But the interesting note, Neel is on a rotating as district president. They're a part of that vote every 3 years. This is Neel's year to actually cast a vote. So it's an interesting process. So with that, I'm going to save any other background information maybe as a part of our Q&A, and I'm going to introduce Neel Kashkari.
Thank you.
Go ahead and have a seat,
Okay,
and then I'm
great.
going to, the next thing we're going to do, I need everybody to get your phones out. This will be interactive Q&A that Neel is going to walk through with some key questions. So go to your text feature, and as you can see the numbers on there, you're going to send to number 22333, and then type in the word Minneapolis. Doesn't matter if it's capitalized or not. Hit send. You should get a response back. Pop-up message. There you go. And now you don't have to hit the link. Correct, Ron? Right. So now you just use this text to ask your questions. And as Neel works through his presentation, we're going to see dynamic results to your responses. And I'm sure you're going to be able to then have some commentary for those questions. So
Great.
With that, I will
Thank
let
you.
you go.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to be with you. Big audience here for a Monday morning. I really appreciate it. I'm going to get to the questions I'm going to ask you here in a few moments. After I give some opening remarks, I'm going to hear some specific feedback from you on the polls. We're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up, live mics coming to you to ask questions directly from me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and your comments. Let me just start by telling you what the Minneapolis Fed is and why I'm here. The Minneapolis Fed is part of our nation's central bank. In 1913, the United States Congress created the Federal Reserve System, created the central bank, but they did something unique. They didn't want the central bank simply housed in Washington, D.C. They wanted it distributed around the country so that all the different regions in the country had a direct voice in the policy process. So the Minneapolis Fed is the 9th Federal Reserve Bank. We represent the 9th Federal Reserve District, and that district includes Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, northwestern Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So a big part of my job and my colleagues' jobs are to travel around our district to try to understand what is happening on the ground in our economies, what's happening in different sectors, what's happening with firms, large and small, what's happening with workers. And then I take that information back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks, where we have these things you read about in the paper, FOMC meetings, Federal Open Market Committee meetings. And what I do in those meetings is, in part, I'm talking about the regional economy and then offering my insight in what I think it means for interest rates for the economy as a whole. Now, we cannot set a different interest rate for Minnesota and for California and for New York. We all use the same dollar. So it's one interest rate, one monetary policy for the nation. But my job is to make sure that this region has a voice in that deliberative process. And my colleagues from the San Francisco Fed, from the New York Fed, the Atlanta Fed, they do the same for their regions. So meetings like this are a great opportunity for me to hear from leaders in a sector, in this case, your industry, a construction industry, infrastructure, really important industry in our economy, to understand what are the challenges your firms are facing, what is your outlook, what impact are our interest rate increases having on your sector and on the economy as you see it. And we're going to have our discussion. We're going to hear directly from you. And then this will help me be informed for our next monetary policy meeting, which is happening in June. So that's why I'm here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for participating, and don't pull any punches. If you have tough questions or you have sharp feedback, I'd rather hear it than not hear it. And so please don't be shy. With that, let's go to the first question, which you're going to be able to answer through your cell phone. So year to date, how are your company revenues compared to the same period last year? Much weaker through much stronger. And we'll see real-time voting here as you type in your answers. So far, 60% saying somewhat stronger, 50%. Okay, so I'm not surprised to hear that in your industry that you all are having a good year. So little to no change. 75% either say no change or stronger. Far fewer are saying weaker. Let's go to the next question. What is your company's project backlog compared with this time last year? How is your company's project backlog compared with this time last year? A is larger, F is smaller. So it looks like your backlogs are generally stronger than they were a year ago. So that's important for me to understand how quickly is the economy slowing. And we traditionally think that sectors of the economy that are highly reliant on debt financing, they're more interest rate sensitive, and they are the first sectors to slow down when we raise interest rates. This says that you're forecasting, you've got large backlogs going into next year. Okay, next question. How would you describe the pipeline for new projects with this time last year? Your pipeline for new projects. Little to no change, much larger, somewhat larger, smaller, or much smaller. So again, your pipelines are continuing to be quite strong. This, by the way, just to give you an editorial comment, this is not indicating a lot of slowing, at least in your part of the economy. Next question. What best describes your demand for labor? Everything from cutting workers to hiring, seasonal, keeping up, or just trying to hire whoever you can get. So very few are cutting workers. Very few are stable, just not hiring, just trying to maintain what you've got. The vast majority are hiring full-time workers or any worker you can get. All right, next question. We just have a few more. Word cloud, 1 to 3 words. What's the biggest challenge for day-to-day operations in your company? So staffing, workforce, hiring, labor, people. I think somebody put coffee in there. I'm not sure if that's a company problem or a this morning problem.
Right.
Experience, staffing, workforce, hiring. Okay, just a couple more. Let's go to the next one. What impact, if any, have regional banking events had on your company or your clients? No impact, all the way to slightly negative impact. Okay, vast majority saying no impact. I think we got one last one. Go ahead, Ron. What's your outlook for your company over the next 6 months? Very optimistic to very pessimistic. Okay, very optimistic, somewhat optimistic. Nobody's very pessimistic in this room. Well, that's great to know. Engineers tend to be on the conservative side. So if this group is very optimistic, that's a pretty strong signal. Thanks, Ron. Thank you for participating in that. It's great for me to be able to just get a sense of where you are and how you all are feeling in your sector, which is a big, important sector of the economy that touches everything else. So that's it for my opening. Why don't we have our conversation?
Great, thank you, Neil. Those are always fun. I like it when we get everybody interact. And I've just got a couple queued up questions I'm going to ask Neil, throw him some softballs here to get it going. And then John and Justin are going to have mics that can take your questions directly. So that's what we really want to spur today, is that interaction with you, the audience, and get Neil to address some of your specific questions. So I guess the first thing I'll look at, which goes more to your background and your profile, you're an aerospace engineer. So kindred souls here in a room full of engineers, you as well. But then also, I see grad school for business, and then you went some time public service at the U.S. Treasury, 2006. Then you went back to private industry, went back to California, 2009. You actually took a run at public office in California on the 2014 ticket for governor. And then also returned back here to Minneapolis for this president's position, and as I noted, assumed that job in 2016. So in your education as an engineer, are there things that you learned that you're using now and really a different, in the financial industry, in the economy? Where's the connection?
Yeah, I did my bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering at the University of Illinois in Urbana before I went into aerospace for a few years before getting my MBA. I found that I use my engineering training every day of my job, because at the end of the day, as you all know, you live it every day. What are engineers? Problem solvers. You have a certain task, you have a certain challenge. You look at this problem that you're trying to solve. You have certain tools available. How do you use the tools that you have available to solve the problem that you're trying to solve? That is literally what policymaking is. So we have inflation that's too high in our economy. I work with a team of brilliant economists every day to look at what are the tools that we have available within the Federal Reserve to try to bring inflation down, and to bring it down, and hopefully in an orderly manner, avoiding leading to some type of a deep recession. What are the models saying about how well those tools work? Which tool do we want to deploy? How do we look at feedback that we're getting from real-time data? Are the tools working the way that we think they should be working? And so it's not the thermodynamics or the fluid dynamics, literally, that I'm using, but it's the raw problem-solving toolkit that I gained in engineering school.
Yep. As I also noted, too, your role coming up, having your 3-year rotation now, you have a vote this year. In the past couple of years, we've seen the increase in rates as a part of trying to control the economy, and the soft landing, as everyone has talked about. How has that worked the last couple of years when you don't have a vote? Have you been kind of like, oh, I would have done something different, or?
It makes much less than you would think, much less of a difference, and here's why. All of the participants in the Federal Open Market Committee go to all the meetings and fully participate in all the meetings, whether they're voting or not. Mm-hmm. So it's a 2-day meeting. It's very organized. People come exceptionally well prepared. About a week or so before the meeting, we get about 100 pages of analysis and different modeling of different states of the economy from Washington, from the economists in Washington. I spend about a week reviewing that analysis with my own team of economists in Minneapolis. Then I go to Washington, D.C., and we all give our views on what's happening in the national economy. Sure. What do we think makes sense for monetary policy? It's the last 30 seconds of the meeting when they call the vote. Some names are called and some are not. So it actually makes much less of a difference than you might think. As opposed to if I didn't go to the meetings when I wasn't voting, then that would make a big difference. But because we're all there fully engaged, it doesn't feel any different to me.
Yeah. So based on some of the polling questions that you saw, and some of the visits that you said you've had recently, what are you hearing? You saw some of the strong responses from our industry. What about other industries that might be tied to ours in construction, material costs? We're seeing them come down a little bit, but they're still much higher. The value of the dollar, especially for construction, is less. What are you hearing and kind of seeing going forward?
As I travel around our region, and I was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan last week, it's similar stories, which is it seems like our region of the economy is still growing at a pretty robust clip. that if you look at labor challenges around our region, and we feel this as an employer, we have 1,100 employees at the Minneapolis Fed. It's still a really strong labor market out there. The labor market is not as frothy as it was 9 months ago. It's not that hot, but it's still a very strong labor market overall, certainly in the construction sector, but in other sectors as well. And you're seeing that nationally. So we've raised interest rates 5 percentage points, which is a lot in a year. And the unemployment rate is still around 3.4%, still almost record low unemployment rate. You know, we think about this like a seesaw. We always talk about we have a dual mandate that Congress has given us. One part of our mandate is what we call stable prices, or 2% inflation. The other part of our dual mandate is maximum employment, as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and contributing to our economy. Well, we think about these two things like a seesaw. So as the economy heats up and your firms have to compete to find workers, the unemployment rate goes down. That leads you to have to pay higher wages, and then that leads to inflation on the other side. And when that happens, we would typically raise interest rates to bring down inflation and to soften the labor market a little bit, bring that into balance. Well, what's happened? Inflation's obviously much, much too high. We've raised interest rates aggressively. Inflation has started to come down. It is softening off of its peak. It's still much too high. But basically, the labor market is still hot. And we have not seen much softening in the labor market. So that tells me that we have a long way to go before we get inflation back down to our 2%. And we at the Federal Reserve probably have more work to do on our end to try to bring inflation back down. And most importantly, we should not be fooled by a few months of positive data. You know, we still are well in excess of our 2% inflation target, and we need to finish the job.
As you look back and talking about workforce, which you saw on the word salad, how strong of an issue that is. ACC actually has a workforce committee specifically on that. I'm participating on one of the subcommittees, and it's on top of mind for everyone when you talk about that maximum employment. But you also look back at some who've literally left the workforce. But I guess my question is back to the Great Recession, and at that time we saw folks exit the industry, and we know that as we're looking to hire, there's a gap in that time range when there were graduates coming out in that 08, 09, and 10 time frame. But the challenges that we see in hiring really affect our business, affect our growth as an industry, both on the private side and for our public partners. How do you see that trending? Initiatives for workforce development, is there a perspective you have that, or things that the Fed is advocating for in those meetings in DC about promoting the ability to get more folks into the technical education stream?
Well, it's a very complicated set of issues that you just touched on. So let's just step back from the technical fields for a moment. If you look when the pandemic hit, first of all, 1 million Americans died from COVID. Let's not forget that. I mean, there's human tragedy. It's also lost potential. And yes, they skewed older, but there were gainfully employed people who lost their lives because of COVID. We also saw a lot of Americans who had the ability to choose to retire early to avoid putting themselves potentially in harm's way or having to uproot their lives. They just said, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm going to retire early. Retirement tends to be pretty sticky. When people retire, they tend to stay retired, but it's not perfectly sticky. There are people who can come back, maybe come back part-time, especially when remote work becomes more possible. That becomes an opportunity. We also lost a lot of immigrants, people who would have immigrated to America, both for political reasons, but also because of the pandemic. The border was largely shut. Those were a lot of potential workers. And then, you know, people have been dealing with childcare issues, taking care of family members, other challenges that they're facing. And so, you know, the labor market continues to recover. On some dimensions, it has fully recovered. But if you look at the number of people working relative to where we expected the number of people working, we're still short 1 million or 2 workers who we desperately need. So longer term, you know, this is all mostly being driven by demographics. We're having fewer children than prior generations. And that means our society is aging. That means we have fewer workers to produce things. and that means we have fewer consumers to buy things. This is not just true in America. This is happening in virtually every major advanced economy in the world. And the only solution we really have to that is reforming our immigration system to bring in the workforce that we need to meet the needs of our economy. It's politically challenging, but it has been a key driver for our nation's economy over our nation's history. And we need to come together as a country and figure out what we want to do with immigration policy. In terms of the technical fields, I would tell you that people respond to wages, people respond to prices. I think about in North Dakota in 2014 when they had the fracking boom going on, they brought in talent from all across the country because they paid up. They didn't just pay up a little bit, they paid up a lot, and people came from around the country. Now, you can't do that if the entire country is facing the same shock at the same time, the same shortage at the same time. But if there are sectors that are facing challenges, people respond to wages. I'll give you an example. I travel around, and a lot of times I will visit colleges and around our district. And I've heard for years and years and years that we don't have enough welders. So I was visiting a community college in Michigan, and the president of the community college was giving me a tour. And I tapped her on the forearm, and I said, you know what? We need more welders. Why don't you train more welders? And she said, we tried. We invested in our school. We doubled the size of our welding program. We hired more instructors. We bought more equipment, and we couldn't get any more students. Wow. And so that told me, welders get pretty well paid. Not well enough. Right. I've heard, I remember hearing a community banker telling me the same story. Welders get paid so much, they're so great, it's such a great job, we need more welders. And I said, how much do your entry-level tellers make? The entry-level bank tellers make a fraction of what a professional welder makes. And I said, well, why don't your entry-level tellers give up their banking jobs and go into welding? And she said, well, that's a really tough job. They wouldn't want to do that. Right. People respond to wages. And so if there really is a shortage, it should show up in wages. I'll give you one more anecdote. I was in North Dakota, and a equipment company told me that we've had a 35-year shortage of diesel engine mechanics. And I said, it sounds to me like we have exactly the right number of diesel engine mechanics, because in 35 years, if there really was a shortage of diesel engine mechanics, the wages of diesel engine mechanics would have gone through the roof. And all these people in this room would have said, gee, I'm going to go be a diesel engine mechanic. And so, these things have a way of sorting themselves out, and wages and prices are the way that you end up attracting people to these various sectors. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but there's a lot embedded underneath it.
Right. No, I appreciate it, because it was a long-winded question, so I appreciate your patience with that. One other question, when we talk about immigration, it leads me to the question about our racial, social equity. I know it's something you're very passionate about. All of our companies are trying to advance that with our DE&I initiatives, but maybe give you a chance to comment on kind of your perspectives on that and the importance for the economy and just for everyone as a society.
Well, one of the things before the pandemic hit, we kept getting surprised at the Federal Reserve. We kept thinking we are at what we call maximum employment. Every able body who wants to work is now gainfully employed. And yet I would go into low-income communities, and they would tell me, we don't have jobs, or we're stuck in part-time jobs, and we want full-time work. And as the labor market got hotter and got tighter, and wages started to creep up, you know what happened? Businesses did extraordinary things to find workers because they needed to. So instead of, traditionally in our economy, when a business looks for a worker, they put a help wanted sign up. I'll give you an example. Down the street from me is a gas station. And the guy who owns the gas station was lamenting to me about how he can't find any workers to work in the gas station. I said, well, what is it normally like? He said, normally they put a help wanted sign up, and that day they have a line of qualified people down the street that he can pick from. That's what we're used to. That's what we have conditioned ourselves to think of as normal. In 2018 and 2019, before the pandemic hit, when businesses couldn't find workers, you know what they did? They said, gee, I guess I'm going to have to train them myself. I'm going to invest in you if you will be willing to show up 5 days a week at 8 o'clock, reliably. I'm willing to invest in you, to train you, so that you can become the worker that I need. And then they started lowering certain requirements. Maybe you actually don't need a college degree for this job. Maybe for certain jobs, maybe not in this field, for certain jobs you don't need the drug test that sometimes would screen people out. Or in some, I even met businesses who said for certain jobs we don't need to do the criminal background check anymore that we used to do. It's going to be very job specific. But a tight labor market incentivized businesses to lower barriers that in many cases they didn't even realize they had erected to reach communities that they hadn't historically been reaching. That actually is a very powerful tool to break down some of these barriers that are leading to disparate outcomes in our societies. And so, at the Minneapolis Fed, what have we done? We've taken a fresh look at all of our jobs and said, do you actually need the actual bachelor's degree to do this job? Do you actually need the advanced degree to do this job? We had a policy in our bank that if you wanted to be an officer, an assistant vice president, a vice president, or a senior vice president, that you had to have a college degree. And yet we had staff in the bank that had been working there for 10 or 15 years very capably, who did not have a college degree, but were advancing and were hitting the ceiling. And we said, that's crazy, let's get rid of that requirement. And then we have actually promoted people who were succeeding, doing a great job, but 20 years ago they didn't get that college degree. And so it's a challenge for all of us. If we really have labor challenges, ask yourselves, are you putting up barriers that are potentially keeping good workers out, harming them and yourself?
Great. John and Justine, or maybe I'll ask one more, maybe get us going, and so while you're answering, then they can...
Just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. And I ask you one thing. We're live streaming this, so do me a favor. When you ask your question, please raise your hand and identify yourself so that I and others know who's asking the question.
So as they're getting ready, I guess one last question that I'll put out. Obviously, the IIJA legislation has brought in a lot of funding, awesome for our industry. You see some of the results showing that backlog and growth. How do you see those type of legislation and infusion of money into the economy in those perhaps one-time disbursement of funds for discretionary grants, earmark projects, versus more investment level that can be maybe a little more steady? Because my question is, do you see a funding hangover coming at some point when a lot of this infusion of money is starting to tail off?
Well, in our country and in most democracies, over time, the system has figured out that you want to keep monetary policy, which are the interest rate decisions, separate from fiscal policy. So fiscal policy are our elected leaders at the local, state, and federal level deciding how much do they want to tax us, who do they want to tax, and what do they want to spend that money on. And so the separation of duties, so to speak, is we leave fiscal policy to them, and then they leave us to set interest rate policy so that we're not being buffeted by political considerations. So what you just described, I'll give it to you from my lens. My lens, it sounds on the margin inflationary in the near term, right? A lot more money coming into concentrated sectors. When you throw money at a certain sector, prices tend to go up because there are resource constraints. And so for me, in the short run, it sounds inflationary on the margin. The question is, on the long run, does it add to inflation? Maybe it adds to our productive capacity. Maybe it's disinflationary over time. These are the dynamics that I'm going to be trying to understand as we see how all of this plays out over the next few years.
Okay. Yep, we got a question right here.
Bruce Tanquist, does the Federal Reserve have a position on where the minimum wage should be?
We do not. This is an example of a fiscal policy question that elected leaders should decide and get to decide. Having said that, after the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul voted to raise their minimum wage, they both asked the Minneapolis Fed to do a long-term economic impact analysis on what are the effects of this? There have been some studies that have said this is just a great outcome for workers. There have been some studies that have said actually this has led to some job losses when other cities and states have done it. And so both cities asked us to do this study, And actually, the state legislature in Minnesota passed a state law to give us access to confidential taxpayer data so that we could do this analysis in a very robust manner. And this is an 8-year study. In fact, last week we had a conference at our bank presenting some of the latest findings of our study. And some of the findings are that overall workers did better, but in certain sectors of the economy, such as the restaurant sector, where the minimum wage is particularly binding, so to speak, because they tend to pay lower wage workers, that there were meaningful job losses. And so for those workers who kept their jobs, they're unquestionably better off, but there were meaningful job losses. So it was not all positive. There were actual trade-offs. This is the kind of research that we like to do, where we can bring our economic expertise to dispassionately study a topic that we think is important without weighing in on, hey, is this a good policy or not? We just want to present the findings and then let the elected leaders use that to decide what policies they want to implement going forward.
Great. Where else do we have? Oh, I see Justine in the back.
Good morning, Mary Carlson with Isthmus Engineering. I heard you talk about the people who passed away during COVID, the lack of immigration. I did not hear you mention the number of women who left the workforce during COVID, and that we have not been able to return because of lack of supply in childcare, the cost of childcare, and then educational disparities. So for example, my family, we're spending hours and hours every week tutoring our child who we discovered had a learning disability during COVID. And we're hoping he can graduate on time, but it's not a given. What is the Fed's position on women in the workforce at this time?
Yeah, thanks for your question. And forgive me if I didn't mention childcare. I meant to. That is a big factor that is keeping affecting a lot of workers, especially disproportionately affecting women. And I will just say, I have 2 toddlers, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and my wife and I are very fortunate that we're able to afford private childcare, but it is an enormous expense. And it's a challenge, even for highly paid people, it is a challenge. For lower paid people, it's insurmountable in many cases. And so it is an absolute barrier for many people. I'll say it this way, I've actually studied this childcare issue for a long time because it's very complicated. On one hand, we have families across the country struggling that they cannot afford childcare. And on the other hand, we have childcare workers who get paid shockingly low childcare wages to provide that really important service. So how can those two things be true? Well, they're both true at the same time because, if you go and hire a lawyer to write a will for you, that lawyer might make more money than you, but you just need 2 or 3 hours of that lawyer's time. But childcare, every hour that you work, you need to pay somebody else to take care of your child or your children. So that means a slice of your income has to go to that person. So unless there's very large income disparity between the worker, the parent, and the childcare worker, it doesn't make economic sense, just in a raw economic way, for you not to just stay home with your own children. So it's like this. There's a farming example that I've come up with. Every government in the world subsidizes agriculture. Do you know why they do that? Because they want high prices for farmers and low prices for consumers. Those two things are directly in tension. So you have to subsidize it to achieve both. So long answer to your question, ultimately we as a country have to decide, is this a priority or not? If it is a priority, the only way to reconcile decent wages for childcare workers and affordability for working families is through government subsidies. But this is an example where the fiscal authorities have to come together and make these decisions. It's not for the Federal Reserve. We don't have a role in this. But I will say, having more women being able to work, having a highly educated workforce, having better access to education from pre-K on up, all of those things will be beneficial to our economic competitiveness long term. And the Minneapolis Fed has actually for decades done analysis on the economic returns to investing in early childhood education. We think the arguments are overwhelmingly positive, but ultimately these are decisions for our political authorities to make.
Great. Go ahead, John.
Good morning, Neil. Bill Goins, listening to some of your thoughts and comments, I know you're in a fairly unique position that you get a chance to look at our region in comparison to some of the other counterparts, San Francisco, Atlanta, other cities. So as you look at this region compared to others, are there 2 or 3 things that you would say, hey, these are things that this region needs to focus on, where maybe we could compete better against some of these other areas of the country? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. One is a strength we have. Our region is very diverse economically. Almost every major sector of the U.S. economy is represented here. And some sectors will be under challenge, but they'll be balanced by sectors that are offsetting that. And that diversity of our economy serves us well. We tend to be a little bit more resilient than economies that are highly concentrated. So that's a positive. A challenge we have everywhere that I go in our region is not just affordable childcare. That's absolutely true. But housing affordability for working families, not just for addressing a homelessness issue, where folks who are struggling with homelessness typically have an income problem, but people who have decent jobs cannot afford a decent place to live. And this is true in red states, it's true in blue states, it's true whatever small town you go to or bigger city. Place to live, and it's an unaffordable place to live, we're going to lose that competition for talent. And when you look at why is it so expensive to, like, if somebody has a good job, why aren't there builders coming in to say, hey, I'm going to build you a house you can afford or an apartment you can afford, right? It's in that builder's economic interest to do so. Well, what I've concluded is that we put up so many barriers at the local and regional level that are inhibitors to more supply coming online. And I'll give you a stark example. So Montana's in my district. Whenever I go to Montana, the first thing I hear about is how crazy the home prices are getting in Montana. And I look around Montana, and Montana's beautiful, and there's a lot of land in Montana. And I say, okay, you're telling me it's so expensive for homes here, why don't you build some homes over there? And they say, oh, no, we can't build homes over there. That would block our views of the mountains. Well, why don't you build homes over there? Oh, no, we can't build homes over there. That's down by the river. We want to protect the river. There are 100 good excuses why they don't want to build more homes. And when I really drill into it, and this is not universally true in Montana, but I've heard this sentiment a lot, people love, Montanans love Montana the way it is, and they don't want more people moving there. And you can't prohibit people from moving to your state, but you can make it unaffordable. And they know that if they build more homes, more people are going to move there. This is happening in Minnesota too. Like, I own my own home. If you wanted to build, and I live in a west suburb of the Twin Cities, which has large lots. If you wanted to build an apartment building on my street, my neighbors would be up in arms and not let you do it. And if you go across the state, there are lots of little local zoning restrictions that sound good in isolation, but are really barriers to more supply coming online. And when you add this up and you add this up and you add this up, it ends up meaning the minimum cost of a new unit goes up and up and up and becomes unaffordable. So this is the biggest challenge we have in terms of our economic competitiveness that is within our control to do something about. This is a self-imposed challenge that we have made, but ultimately it's one that we all have to own ourselves because we are all part of it in demanding that we keep our neighborhoods just the way we have them. And we all have this philosophy, let them build somewhere else. I'm going to keep my neighborhood the way I like it. And that means we don't build anywhere, and the price goes up.
Yep. Just Ann.
Hi, I'm Michelle Chuk from MnDOT. What are your thoughts on the impact of the movement towards sustainable energy on the transportation sector, but also the regional economy and the U.S. economy in general?
Well, it's like a lot of things. It's complex. Like I've seen some analysis of the new Inflation Reduction Act, which has big climate provisions built in there. That it's going to be a big deal, is the way it's been described to me. A lot more solar coming online, a lot more wind coming online. I've seen some forecasts that say that if all of this wind and solar comes online as expected, that in some parts of the country you're going to see negative power prices, at least for meaningful parts of the day. So kind of hard to wrap your head around negative power prices. What do you do with that? Well, maybe that's when all of the electric vehicles get charged. Maybe they've got smart chargers and then they hit the grid at the right time when the power costs are the minimum. And so maybe that means it becomes really cheap for us to power our cars. There's a quirk in economics. If you make something really cheap like that, so it's cheap or free to power your electric car, people are going to drive more. And so that's not exactly the goal of putting more miles on the roads as a result of well-intentioned climate policy. So a lot of times when these big policy things come online, the long-term effects are really hard to map out exactly on the front end. What I think I know is a lot more solar will come online, a lot more wind will come online. We're going to need to have a lot more transmission to be able to take advantage of that, to get from where the wind is and the sun is to where the demand for that power is. We're going to need a lot more batteries. That's going to tax our sources, the materials for those batteries. We're going to need to start developing some of those sources domestically here, which is something we don't like to do. We don't like to say this, but we'd much prefer to have the dirty extraction industries in somebody else's country. Well, we're going to have to bring them home if we're actually going to meet the needs of some of the green energy transition policies. So I think it's big, I think it's complicated, and I think that the full implications are going to take time to sort out.
Yep, John.
Mr. Kashkari, thank you for being here. I'm Jacob Gay with MnDOT. And I'm wondering about if employment is one of the mandates of the Fed, how are you considering the increase in automation and artificial intelligence over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
I'm a big believer in the value of labor. Kind of for all of modern recorded history, prognosticators have said the machines are going to do away with workers and we're all going to be unemployed. And I'm not going to get the data right. 150 years ago, the vast, vast, vast majority of Americans worked on farms. Automation came to farms, workers moved into cities and into factories. There's going to continue to be an evolution in the nature of our work. I think we're all going to become more productive. Fewer, maybe menial tasks are we going to have to do. We're going to have to do things, using our brain. Education is going to become more and more important. It has been over time. That's only going to continue. For what it's worth, I tried ChatGPT, and I've asked it a number of questions, and it just makes up answers. And so, if college students think that they're going to graduate submitting these essays, they're only going to pass their classes if ChatGPT is also doing the grading, because it's basically gibberish from what I could tell. I'll give you one more example on this question. 5 or 6 years ago, Elon Musk predicted that all the long-haul truckers in America would be unemployed by now. They'd all be gone, because the first thing you're going to automate with autonomous vehicles are long-haul truckers. Hasn't happened yet. I read an article recently that said $100 billion with a B has gone into self-driving technologies, and we're no closer than we were 5 or 10 years ago, because the cars can't turn left. That's what the article said. So, I'm strongly in favor of innovation. I'm strongly in favor of productivity-enhancing breakthroughs, but these things tend to be a lot harder than they sound when the PowerPoint presentation is first put together and takes a lot longer. So I'm bullish on the outlook for labor, though the nature of our jobs is going to keep changing.
Oh, Justan's got one over to the left.
Hi, I'm Matt Rubel, Braun Intertech. I have a comment and a question. Comment is, it's obvious from the survey results, we are in the public sector, we're transportation. 15 to 20 years ago, our group worked really hard at getting dedicated funding. Some more gas tax, some more dedicated funding. So we're kind of insulated a little bit from a funding standpoint. There's still a gap with inflation and less gasoline being used, and there's a funding gap. But we're a little more insulated and maybe positive. My question is that our company has a private sector group too, and you mentioned the housing thing, and that's our quandary is we see less on a individual single-family lots, and in multifamily there's less starts right now. You're seeing those metrics from less starts coming up, and so there's people pulling back on individual single-family lots, and at multifamily the lenders are pulling back, and so that is now driving up prices. It was too hot to start with. We need to slow down, but with the interest rates coming up, there is a slowdown there, and that's hurting development of new housing, which is a quandary. We need more housing. There's less than we need. That's increasing our costs as employees too. So that's probably the one metric I see that's really impacting our industry as a company right now.
Thank you. I agree with what you said. I'm not surprised with what you said. You know, people will say, well, wait a second, we've got this housing challenge and you're raising interest rates and that's making it more expensive. Doesn't that work against you? And that is true in the short run. In the short run, we need to get inflation down. And most forecasts say that inflation should come down to our 2% level over the next couple of years. Once we get through that period and interest rates normalize to something like normal prior to the pandemic, then I would expect that the mortgage rates would recover and it'd be easier for builders to go back, and the bank environment will be stronger, you know, less of the stresses that we're feeling right now. And so we have to get through this transition period to get inflation back down, and then we'll be in a better position, and your company and others will be in a better position to tackle the longer term structural challenge we have of simply needing more housing units, whether it's single family homes or multifamily developments.
Good morning. Gary Harris, Iowa DOT. Could you speak to the Fed timeline on the CBDCs and some of the financial privacy concerns that come with that?
Yeah, so the gentleman is asking about central bank digital currencies, and the Fed is studying the issue of a central bank digital currency. Think about, you know, Bitcoin. Instead of Bitcoin being created by this anonymous consortium, imagine if a central bank issued its own version of Bitcoin, and apparently the Chinese central bank has issued a Chinese version. So we're studying it. In terms of timing, first thing is we've been very clear, and our chairman has been very clear, that we believe it would take an act of Congress, first of all, to allow us to do this. We couldn't just do it on our own. Number two, even more important than that, from my perspective, what problem are we trying to solve? And here's the thing, whether it's Bitcoin or a central bank digital currency, nobody has been able to articulate what problem it is actually solving. People get excited about something that sounds innovative. I want to be in favor of innovation too, but let's be clear about what problem we're solving. So I'll give you an example. I can send anybody in this room $5 right now, instantly, using Venmo or PayPal or Zelle. So what is it that a central bank digital currency could do that Venmo can't do? Well, nobody's been able to articulate anything. It's just a bunch of hand-waving word salads about maybe it's better on financial inclusion, maybe it's better on cross-border remittances, but there's no evidence that it actually is better in any of those dimensions. So why would China do it? Well, in theory, a government could monitor every one of your transactions with a central bank digital currency. We would not be in favor of that at the Federal Reserve, but I can see why China would be in favor of that. In theory, a government could impose negative interest rates on your account. You can't do that with Venmo, and we don't want to do that at the Federal Reserve, but I can see China wanting to do that. And you could directly tax your accounts. You can't do that with Venmo. Again, we wouldn't want to do that. I can see why China would do that. So I guess I share a lot of the privacy concerns that you raised in your question. We have no interest in violating those privacies, the American people's privacies at the Federal Reserve. But if the only use case is to penetrate the privacy barrier, that doesn't sound like a good trade for the American people. And so I've developed a very deep skepticism at this point, because for year after year after year, I've been asking the same questions, and none of the enthusiasts have been able to answer these questions. And so I remain very skeptical, but I'm going to keep my mind open and see what the studies come up with.
Great. Well, we are quickly, you want one, if
You
it's a
want
quick
one more?
A quick
One
one.
more.
All right.
All right, here, make it quick.
On schedule.
Okay, thank you for being here this morning. My name is Brian Jastrom from Rockleaf Water Environmental. And in this national economy, do you see growth for the sake of growth as the best policy for driving the national economy?
Well, you're asking somewhat of a philosophical question that is really best directed at our elected leaders who are there to make some of these decisions. So I think the root of your question is, do you just grow the pie, or do you make sure that the distribution of the growth is allocated a certain way? I mean, that really is at the heart of our political system and judgments that our political system needs to make. I will say this, an economy where the pie is not growing is not a good economy. We do need the pie to grow. You see economies where they've stopped growing and they stagnate. Stagnant economies are really not vibrant. They don't lead to innovation. They don't lead to better standards of living over time. If you look, I saw somebody give a speech, I think it was George Will gave a speech a year or two ago, and he talked about, would you rather be the richest man in America 100 years ago or poor in America today? And he made this very compelling argument that you would rather be poor in America today than the richest man in America 100 years ago, because you had, whether it's electricity or running water or basic health care, the basic provisions that even the lowest earning members of our society have are leaps and bounds beyond what the richest member of our society had 100 years ago. So I strongly believe in the value of economic growth, but I also believe that we need to have a society where everybody can participate in the benefits of that. And I don't think we have that today, and I do think that these are important challenges that ultimately our political system, as flawed as it is, our political system needs to come together to try to address.
All right, with that, we're going to wrap it up.
Thank
Neel,
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Everyone, give Neel a round of applause. Reflective.